One of my favorite episodes of The Office, which by the way is just one of the best shows ever, you have to agree on that, right? There's an episode in one of the early seasons where they're talking about ethnicity and diversity. And someone makes a comment, something to the effect of that the term Mexican is a slur. And they're like, well, no, it's not. It's, it's a nationality. But I think there's some truth in that a lot of people, when they think Mexican, there is a connotation involved. See, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, born in 1981, graduated high school in 99 here in America. In a time where racism, the way I see it and still do, it's not about blacks versus whites. Is there still tension there? Absolutely. But I was also growing up in a time where I saw Hispanics coming into our town and our school and becoming involved in it, and English wasn't their first language. So I was seeing these concepts of racism towards Mexicans, whites versus Mexicans. If they're going to come to our country, they need to speak our language. They need to stop stealing our jobs, which if they speak our language, they'll steal more of our jobs, which it's funny they never put that together. All right. But I think what happens is by default is that a lot of Americans tend to look at Mexicans as like a second-rate citizen. Unless English is their first language, and especially if it's questionable on whether or not they're here legally, it sort of turns Mexicans into this large encompassing group. It doesn't matter if you're born here and you just happen to be ethnically from Mexico and you speak perfectly English and all this good stuff. You end up getting put in the same category as someone who is here illegally and can't speak English very well. And I feel that subconsciously Mexican almost has a negative connotation subconsciously in the minds of a lot of people. Not me, because I am a quarter Mexican. I grew up seeing that and realizing that. But it's funny because I can even think back, like, I think it just comes down to whether you feel like you're inside versus outside what's going on. I'm going to tell you this story that's kind of ironic and funny, I guess, maybe. So my Mexican grandma, I remember back when I was in high school, where she lived, she looked out her window and she had some Mexican neighbors. And they were born in Mexico and they mainly spoke Spanish. They spoke enough English to get by. Whereas my grandma was born in America and not allowed to speak Spanish in her home because her parents wanted her to become Americanized. So I had a Mexican grandma who couldn't speak Spanish and lived next door to a couple different other families who were Mexican. And she told me one day about how that they were, she said it was just the worst thing. I looked out the window and I saw those Mexicans and they had a goat on a stick and they were roasting it. They were eating the goat. That's just, oh, that's awful. Now, the point of that story is that my ethnically Mexican grandma said, those Mexicans. And I even said, but you're Mexican. But it somehow got lost and there was no response to that. She just couldn't get past the fact that people were eating a goat, like right outside her backyard. And I think even that story speaks a little bit on what I'm getting at here, is that maybe if in any way that the term Mexican has a negative connotation to it, and even on The Office when they reference, is that a slur to say someone's Mexican? I think it has to do with how inside the American culture you are versus not. My Mexican grandma was 100% within the full American experience, but she was born here and didn't speak Spanish. But she was 100% Mexican. But then her neighbors were the newcomers. My grandma was an American who just happened to be ethnically Mexican, and both of her parents grew up in Mexico. But I think that story illustrates the fact of why that is. When it's seen as a negative connotation, it's more like this. Instead of look at those Mexicans, there's some Mexicans. It's more like, look at those outsiders who aren't from here and are just from across the border, but they're not really part of us. they're Mexicans. And I think that's really the undertone, the subconscious undertone that kind of makes it have that negative connotation to it. I think it's a very confusing thing. And racism isn't as simple as just black versus white. I think it's also white versus Mexican. And always having this distrust or reserve for people who are not truly American. They're just kind of visiting and they're hanging around, but they're not really part of us. What are your thoughts on that? I think it's an intriguing conversation. I think it's something that is worth unpacking. And I don't think that a politically correct answer is the end of that conversation. I think that it's a complex thing. And I think Mexicans are treated as second-rate citizens. Whether they're legal or not, I think, just like I made the video a couple days ago, if you could choose a last name Gomez or Goldstein, which would you choose? Everyone who was answered said Goldstein. It's not a coincidence. All right, let's talk more in the comments.